Hello, my name's Sean, and welcome to another episode of Science with Sean. Today, we're going to talk about a little bit of the history of evolutionary thought, kind of how it came about, the some prominent figures that really contributed to evolutionary theory, and just kind of continuing to look at some of the evidence for evolution. This is not something that I really learned a whole lot about growing up, but I think it's really interesting stuff. And whether you believe in it or not, hopefully you just come with an open mind. And I think this stuff is really fascinating material. So um, hopefully you enjoy it, and yeah, let's just get started. So really, evolution was kind of first thought about by the ancient Greeks. It really wasn't, um, you know, the first person that usually comes to mind for people when they think about evolutionary biology is Darwin. But Charles Darwin was not the first person to kind of even think of the concept of evolution. It was really the ancient Greeks, some of the philosophers during that time. And so, really, what Darwin did with his publication of The Origin of Species in 1859, um, he really discovered a couple of the main mechanisms that by which evolution occurs, and those two are natural selection and sexual selection. A lot of biologists kind of focus on like the natural selection because it's talked about more. Some evolutionary psychologists like to focus more on like the sexual selection. Both are really fascinating mechanisms to kind of think about the processes by which evolution occurs. There are more than just those two for sure. But during Darwin's day, he didn't have a lot of the access that we do to just modern science within the last, 150, 200 years. So he really had no concept of inheritance or genetics. And that's really what kind of makes it fascinating that he would be able to kind of come up with not just proving evolution more or less, but um, also coming up with how it occurs. So yeah, um, and sexual selection, most people don't know, aren't familiar with that. So natural selection really focuses on, you hear about the common phrase survival of the fittest, really focuses on uh, the variation in which enables an organism or species to survive or procreate, and ways in which traits are conducive to enabling both of those things to occur. Now, sometimes with sexual selection, it actually focuses more on not so much the survival aspect, but uh, really how to successful mating strategies throughout the animal kingdom, or not even necessarily the animal kingdom, but one prime example that a lot of people think of or hear about at least once in their lifetime is the peacock's tail. So the length and the color of a peacock's tail. Um, the reason why that's significant is that it actually hinders the peacock from surviving. So a lot of times the length of the peacock tail, the longer the tail, the more availability or opportunities that they have to mate the males with the females. So a male's tail length is a huge contributor to the the success in the mating market, so to speak, and so. But not just the length of the tail, also the color of the tail. It has very bright colors, and it's very illuminating. And while that does attract females, it also makes the male more susceptible to predators observing them, and so it's actually hindering their survival in that way as well. And this is called, in like fancy scientific terminology, it's called antagonistic pleiotropy. And so that's just another method in which evolution can occur, where the most basically where there's variation in tail length, variation in the color of the tail. Those who have longer tails and those who have brighter tails are going to mate more often, and are going to produce offspring that are going to have probably longer tails and brighter tails. So, and over time, you do that for thousands of years, thousands of generations, millions of years. Um, and there's going to be a great significant, there's going to be a significant difference in the morphology over time. Their what's called their phenotype, their physical attributes. And so now I kind of talked about earlier how Darwin didn't know about inheritance. So he really didn't discover inheritance. Gregor Mendel did, and his work didn't really become popular until about 40 years after Darwin released The Origin of Species. Now, Mendel did um, was doing research prior to Darwin talking about his publication on The Origin of Species, but it's not really known if Darwin was aware of Mendel's research. So um, his research on plants, and that really transformed our understanding of genetics and inheritance. How not just plants can change over time, but how humans, how any species really can change over time. So, and then a third point would probably be the emergence of DNA really changed things for sure. So now we don't just have like the physical anatomy of an animal. That's how a lot of people prior to the revolution that DNA synthesis and production really changed things. All comparative anatomists had were just, the corpses of animals to really compare and see, based off of their similar physical attributes, um, be able to kind of develop a evolutionary tree of life, the history of where things evolve from, what organisms evolve from where, and that makes sense. Just thinking about it, like you know, organisms that have a similar evolutionary history. The most similar animals are going to probably have split from a recent common ancestor, but that's actually not the case a lot of times. The eye can kind of be deceiving in that way. And so, what DNA allows us to do is actually see the degree of relatedness from a very objective uh, standard, and because we just can't see the DNA sequences that that are involved in limbs or eyes and stuff like that. So with DNA, it actually corrected a lot of faulty thinking and how previous scientists really categorized um, the evolutionary tree of life. And so some kind of couple facts that are, I think, interesting that most people don't really know about is that only 1.5%, 1 to 2% of the human genome, uh, the the genome is just the accumulation of all the different genes within the human being. So the genome, about 1.5% of the human genome actually codes for anything that's known. It's called protein encoding DNA. And some people have probably heard of the phrase junk DNA. So about 98, 99% of our human DNA is going to be junk DNA. Now, scientists are actually discovering that not all junk DNA has unknown functions or no known functions. There is more research being done on some of the non protein encoding DNA. And so, but yeah, in terms of discussing like just the evidence for evolution, not just, the history of evolution, there's a few different ways in which we can kind of go about it. One is that the concept of intelligent design. So, this is about 45% of people believe in evolution, but only like 10% or so have a very naturalistic understanding of evolution. Evolution doesn't require a designer, and so about 35% of people think that there is a designer behind evolution. And so, um, but there are lots of different examples of like unintelligent design. So, for example, considering the human genome, our own DNA, about 14% of our DNA is actually just due to copying errors from procreating. And so these can look like substitutions, additions in our DNA, deletions of certain um, base pairs or whatever. So those are a few different examples of mutations, like insertions, substitutions, and deletions. So 14%, a good chunk of our DNA is just due to copying errors. So that kind of undermines a little bit, at least. I don't expect that to, you know, convince people right away that, oh yeah, evolution is definitely a thing, which it is, but um, I'll go into more detail and elaborate more on different lines of evidence for evolution. There are a lot of different ways that we can go about it. So, considering unintelligent design, that's more so considering, whether or not evolution was actually designed by intelligent being or not. So, I would argue my current position is just that it's not necessary, and that perhaps there's some evidence out there that actually were not very intelligently designed. Another reason would just be like one of the most common problems humans have are low back problems. And this is really because for much longer in our evolutionary history, most mammals and primates are primarily quadrupedal. So they walk on four legs, and over time, we are now not horizontal, but now we are standing up vertically. And so that creates a lot of pressure on the back that we weren't really designed to do very effectively. So that's one reason. Um, but I can get back to the concept of intelligent design or unintelligent design later. And I touched on this already, but considering genetics and DNA, um, everything is DNA. The simplest life forms have genetic material like viruses and bacteria, and we can actually learn quite a bit from like even about humans from studies on E. coli, for example, or um, invertebrates like C. elegans, which is just a worm basically. Um, and then seeing how closely related we are to other primates. Uh, we have it's about a 1% difference in DNA between a chimpanzee and a human being. So that's I think that really kind of for me, I when I started looking at that and looking at the similarities in DNA between chimps and humans, that was like it didn't convince me necessarily that like that Christianity wasn't true, but like the fact that we are so similarly related to other beings genetically, it really kind of dismantled my belief in that humans are like the epicenter or the apogee of creation. We're not the center of the universe. We're not necessarily higher on the food chain, so to speak, than other animals. Other animals have just adapted different ways of surviving and reproducing, and those ways are just as equally valid as the methods that we employ. So, um, yeah, yeah. Just moving on, another way that we can look at evolution is just through fossils, uh, looking at intermediary fossils in between like certain pivotal transitions throughout history. So, probably the most common ones are Archaeopteryx. So, that's the transition between a dinosaur and a bird. Birds and dinosaurs are both very closely related, and it's a transition between it's about a midway point between a dinosaur and a bird. So Archaeopteryx, you can look at it more detail, but essentially it's just a dinosaur with feathers. Its facial properties, its teeth resemble more like that of a dinosaur, or um, certain features with the claws or the feet are more resembling one species or another, but it's a pretty good balance between two very different species. Um, and then another one's called Tiktaalik. So this is the transition from when we were primarily all fish, hundreds of millions of years ago. Um, the first vertebrates were around 500 million years ago is when we start seeing fossil evidence. And then Tiktaalik is basically the transition from water to land. So this is a fish that has actually the exact same arm morphology that we do. Um, they have a humerus, a radius, an ulna. So one arm bone, two forearm bones, and then they also have some of the wrist bones as well in Tiktaalik. So that enabled this tetrapod, which just means four limbs, this four-limbed fish to have access to land, at least, even if not primarily on land. It would have enabled this creature to uh, perhaps escape from predators and serve as kind of a sanctuary away from other predators in the water, or more access to food, stuff like that. So those are a couple intermediary fossils, common ones that are often cited. Another way to kind of go about evolution is looking at vestigial traits. So basically, traits that no longer serve a purpose um, for the current animal, uh, but have still kind of remained with the current animal from other species. So it's kind of hard to describe, but like a good visual would be whales still have hind bones. They still have like leg bones, and you just can't see it because it's hidden beneath the skin and all the blubber and stuff like that. But there are there's a leg skeleton basically, um, the appendicular skeleton, still has remained intact a little bit. Um, and then another example would be a pretty similar example would be certain snakes actually still have leg bones. You just can't see them with the skin unless you dissect them and stuff like that. So that is a pretty good indicator that species are not static. They continually change. The hard part is that our lifetimes are only 80 years, and it takes millions of years, oftentimes, to really see any kind of significant change that would be transitioning from one species to another. So another really cool one, perhaps my favorite, is embryology. So you actually see a lot of the. Um, so if you consider like a chicken, a reptile, or so sorry, if you consider like a reptile, a mammal, a primate, or even going back all the way down to a fish, you see these transitions. If you consider a human being, we start off looking a lot like a fish. We have these pharyngeal slits that would normally in a fish turn into gills, but it actually transitions into our anatomy. Um, and so, yeah, that's actually really interesting to me that we actually, when we're just uh, really young in the womb, at a certain point, we start developing basically gills almost. So, um, yeah, yeah. And um, so a fish will start looking more like an amphibian if it's an amphibian. And then if it's a mammal, it'll go through the same stages, regardless of whatever mammal it is. If it's a kangaroo or a chimpanzee, you'll see them start off as fish, transition to amphibian like features, and then reptiles, and then start developing those mammalian characteristics. Um, so that's a really cool area of research, seeing the development. It's called developmental biology or ontogenesis, stuff like that. And then you can see corroboration of evidence with like geography, for example. So the dinosaurs went extinct around 66, 65 million years ago. And there's just a total disappearance of dinosaurs throughout the world in the fossil record. As soon as you get to that 66, 65 million year mark, there before that, tons of dinosaurs, they're thriving. Mammals are there, but they're very small just because of the dominance of the predators that dinosaurs are or were rather. And so, but after the 65 million year mark, there's nothing. There's no evidence of dinosaurs. And then you can actually see uh, the asteroid or the crater that was left, and it's been dated to the exact same time period, that 66, 65 million year mark. It's off of like close to the Yucatan Peninsula. So just south of North America. And so, yeah, it's just to see that those two are what are called corroborated. Different, completely different fields of science actually meeting together and supporting each other is a really important um, scientific endeavor or methodology. So, yeah, yeah. And then we have other things like I had mentioned comparative anatomy earlier in the video, but we have uh, studying, say, the immune system. So all primates have the same blood types. They'll have the A antigen, the B antigen, and the O antigen. And so they have those three there in all species of monkeys and apes, whether that's a rhesus monkey, or a chimpanzee. And kind of fun fact, you know the rhesus factor that humans have, whether you are an O negative or an O positive, that's positive or negative sign or connotation was first discovered in rhesus monkeys. So a lot of some research has, kind of actually come from other species in terms of our immune system. Chimpanzees were used to develop vaccines for um, different, like, hepatitis research, and so we wouldn't have those vaccines if it weren't for research on chimps. Not supporting research on chimps like that, nothing invasive like that, but um, that's just kind of illustrating that our immune systems are, it's almost 100%. It's like about 99. I could give you the citation, but it's 99.99% the same immune system. There's all kinds of diseases that we spread between humans and chimps. Another example would be the polio outbreak. And so there were humans giving it to chimps, and chimps that were getting, paralyzed partially throughout. And Jane Goodall talks about that in her research, if you've heard of her, in some of her books. So yeah, and then we have a lot of the same hormones. That's another fascinating topic for me. Just all mammals and a lot of vertebrates have pretty much the same hormones. Whether you're talking about the famous stress hormone cortisol, or if you're talking about testosterone and estrogen. Um, yeah, there's all kinds of hormones we could go through, and um, it's a really what's called conserved characteristic throughout vertebrate evolution, or um, mammalian evolution and stuff like that. So, endocrinology is a really fascinating area of research. It's probably my favorite, endocrinology and neurology, because the brain produces so many hormones and things like that. So um, we can study the brains of other species. Really, um, I'm not going to get too much into like the brain and stuff. I'll do that another time. But yeah, yeah. So that's pretty much it for today. Um, I hope this was at least interesting and kind of get you thinking about things. Or I'm not trying to deconvert anyone, just to reiterate. Um, I'm just trying to help people, kind of inform them, educate them on maybe some topics that aren't discussed a whole lot, for fear of reprisal, or whatever the case may be. But yeah, this is a subject of passion for me, and so I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll come out with some more videos in the future. So thank you for your time.